Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Adult Programs Librarian Kristen Motti from the Boston Public Library. We're thrilled to be here this afternoon with our collaborators at Beacon Hill Village for another informative program. And thank you very much for being here with us on this lovely November afternoon. You may have noticed when you came in that your microphones are muted and your cameras are turned off. And if you do have a question, you can go ahead. There's a little button at the bottom. If you're not familiar with this webinar format, there's a little button that says Q&A. You can go ahead and type your questions in there. We'll be getting to questions toward the end of the program. And to talk a little bit more about Beacon Hill Village and to tell us more about the program and introduce our guests today, I'd like to introduce Betsy Peterson from the Living Well, Ending Well Committee of Beacon Hill Village. Betsy, welcome.
Thank you, Kristen. It's been such a joy to have this collaboration with the Boston Public Library. Beacon Hill Village, as many of you know, is an organization that was founded by people who really wanted to stay in their own homes, but thought they might need more help as they got older. And so they came up with a model for a member-driven organization, which has inspired more than 350 other communities to found villages or to work on opening villages. One of our priorities has always been for our members to help our members make decisions. Autonomy has been important to us. And of course, one of the elements of making good decisions is good information. So for some years, Beacon Hill Village has been offering programs on tough topics like how to plan a memorial service or a funeral. And this is the fourth year of the Living Well, Ending Well program. It's our second collaborating with the Boston Public Library, and we are so grateful to the library for making that possible. First, we enjoyed using your space in Copley Square, and now we're very grateful that you can bring this program to us. I think we need to get Joy on the screen. Joy? I'll introduce Laura while we're waiting for Joy to appear. Rabbi Laura Abrasley is the co-senior rabbi of the Temple Shalom in Newton. And it is an inclusive Reform Judaism congregation. The Reverend Joy Fallon is the senior minister of King's Chapel, which is in downtown Boston at the corner of School and Tremont Streets. And both of these congregations have attracted people who travel some distance to get to their services and activities. Of course, when the pandemic hit, they had to rearrange their ways of doing things. But if you go to the websites of King's Chapel or Temple Shalom, I think you'll be impressed by the creativity of the ways that they are making it possible to worship online and to take part in other activities online. So thank you so much, Joy and Laura, for being with us today. And Laura, I understand, is going to go first.
Laura, I think you're muted.
Yeah, so once again, Betsy just said how great we are with technology, and I can't even unmute myself. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It's a shame that we can't see you, but we know you're out there. We can feel your energy, and it is really a blessing to be with you this afternoon as we share with you, some information about a difficult topic, but a topic that's really important for all of us to talk about, this moment of planning for our end. a good life and a good death is really, really something that we should strive for. So this afternoon, Rabbi Fallon and I, I'm going to give you Reverend Fallon and I are going to share with you a little bit about our faith traditions and how we understand this life cycle moment. And then we're going to speak to you a little bit about the planning that you can do for yourself or for family members, which is really a beautiful blessing that we can all give to one another. And then I promise we will leave plenty of time for questions, and Reverend Fallon and I will kind of go back and forth a little bit. We've enjoyed meeting each other and spending time with each other preparing this for you. So I am going to share my screen a little bit and begin with the Jewish sort of overview of how we understand this life cycle moment. So hopefully this will work. Okay, let's go ahead and make it a full screen here for all of you. All right, everyone. So in Judaism, we like to start with stories. So I'm going to start with a short story that actually kind of frames our entire conversation today, the importance of planning. And this beautiful story comes from a text called the Talmud, which is actually a huge text, many, many volumes of Jewish religious law and theology. And many of you may have heard this story before. It tells the story of an old man who is planting a tree. And a young man or a young person walks by and asks, what are you planting? And the man says that he is planting a carob tree. And the youth decides that this man is a fool because it takes over 70 years for a carob tree to bear fruit. And the old man says, that's okay. Just as others have planted for me, I plant for future generations. Judaism indeed puts a lot of emphasis on this idea of planning and making sure that future generations have information and knowledge and what they need to go forward, that we pass on that wisdom. And so Judaism's life cycle events are often kind of about that. And indeed, it is the case also with the last life cycle for all of us, which is death, dying, and mourning. So the way that I'm going to frame my sort of understanding of my faith tradition, and I will give you the caveat that this is a reform or progressive understanding of Judaism. Judaism is a very kind of broad, far-reaching religion, been around for a long time, and so there are more progressive and more traditional sort of views of things. I'm going to share with you what I understand, and when I use the word traditional, it just means it's been around for a long time. It doesn't mean that every Jew is necessarily going to do this. It just means it's been around for a long time. So ideally, Judaism there's three sort of overarching principles that I would want to share with you that we teach that death is a part of every life, right? So we, throughout our services, both in the daily practices as well as certain times a year, really try to provide opportunities to think about our own mortality, not to dwell on that necessarily, but so that we are living a good and full life, right? So knowing that at some point we will no longer be here. So are we the full person that we want to be in every moment? Another principle is this idea of simplicity in death as in life. And you see that a lot when you see the funeral service itself. The liturgy is fairly simple. The caskets are fairly simple, not because your life was simple, but because it's this idea of, we want to live a full life, and in death, it's okay to keep things kind of simple. And the last thing I'll share is this idea of the value of community. The community is something that Judaism is a fundamental idea, but especially towards the end of life, the community will come back in, both for the person who's dying and then after they have passed away, as well as the mourners, making sure that there is a community aspect to all of this. I'm going to share sort of this overarching idea in three principles again. So the rituals of dying in Jewish tradition, as I mentioned, it is important to face death and wrestle with our own mortality, both our own and the ones we love. And for those of you who are looking at the pictures, they're coming from all over the place, so there's no real significance in them. They're just, trying to find the right pictures. And we teach, tradition teaches us that we should not die alone, and so dying should be attended to and included in the community of the living until the end. So when you're in the room with someone who is towards the end of their life, you should not necessarily say something that you wouldn't want them to hear. The assumption is that we are alive until we are not. And you are part of the community until your last dying breath. And then there is an idea that I like to share with people, because we do have confession in Judaism, and there's a deathbed confession. It actually is included in our regular liturgy, but in particular is one for the end of our life. And this is a final opportunity before death to return to God in the same state of purity of which you entered the world. And in the moments that I've been blessed to be in someone's presence toward the end of the life, either the dying can offer this moment or a loved one can offer it on their behalf. Once we move into the next phase, someone has passed away and there is a funeral or a memorial service. These things are done in a variety of different ways. As I mentioned, progressive Judaism has modified this throughout the ages, but I'm going to give you a kind of traditional understanding of this. In Judaism, we try to bury as quickly as possible, and the body is not left alone until it has reached its final resting place. You may have heard of this before, this idea of something called a chevra kadisha, sort of a holiness friends is the way I might necessarily translate that. But their job is to be with the body. The body should not be left alone until it is placed in its final resting place. This is one of my sort of favorite ideas in this moment, that we both need to care for the body and we need to care for the soul. All the rituals tend to be simple. Bodies are usually dressed in white, sometimes in a shroud, sometimes in a prayer shawl. The coffins tend to be plain. Often in Jewish funerals, you will not necessarily see flowers, although sometimes you do as well. There really is no right or wrong in some of these things. Pre-COVID, service usually takes place in the chapel and then goes graveside. The liturgy is Psalms, there's a eulogy, and there's two specific prayers. One that many people know called the Kaddish. Here I share with you is Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, and the prayer called El Maleh, which is about asking God to take the soul of the departed into God's loving embrace. Another thing that many people may know about Jewish funerals is this idea of shoveling dirt onto the grave at the conclusion. This ritual is also one that I think can provide real meaning for people in these moments. The sense of finality helps to sort of close that circle of life. And the service ends with participants escorting a family to what's called Shiva, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But in Judaism, once we have laid our loved ones to rest, our job is then to pay attention to the mourners, those who are left behind. And again, there's a pretty decent playbook for this in Judaism, this idea of Shiva, and both the first 7 days, first 30 days, and first 11 months when someone has passed away. In this moment, we don't have a lot of time, so I want to make sure just to kind of cover Shiva. Traditionally, it's 7 days. Most progressive Jews these days will at least observe 3 days most of the time. Some people observe more, some people observe less. It traditionally begins with a meal of condolence, which this is one moment where you let the family eat first, and then you eat. Friends and family are encouraged to come to the mourner's home to share memories and to offer support to the family. You'll definitely see a lot of food at a Shiva. And traditionally, you would see people covering the mirrors and sitting on those stools or wearing torn clothing. And there's usually a community prayer service so that the mourners can recite this prayer that I mentioned called the Kaddish Yatom. You don't see all of these things. You'll see sort of a mishmash depending on whose home you're going to. But this is a sort of overarching view. And of course, there are reasons for all of this. If you have those questions, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A. But now I want to turn it over to my colleague, Rev Fallon, who's going to share a little bit about her faith tradition.
Thank you very much. I also have some slides. Thank you so much, Rabbi Laura. I want to talk about not only some Christian traditions, but also what may be some more secular traditions, because at King's Chapel, I find that quite a number of the people who come and seek support at a time of a memorial or a funeral often are people who are here in the neighborhood, who have had some brush with King's Chapel and are looking for a way that they can honor the person who has died, yet they may not be members of our congregation, and they may not always identify as Christian as my congregation does. So let's go to the first slide if we could. Oops, Amanda. Yeah, great. So Christian theology would generally say we are entering into a period after death of this eternal life with God, and that life in some way continues after death. People say this is, in a way, death doesn't have the final word. God has prevailed. And as I understand it, this is a universal promise to everybody of every religious tradition or none, that the God who I understand is all love, we all come together in one place, knit together as one people. Yeah, there's a mystery to this. None of us has gone through this part of the passage, so we can't describe it. I describe it as saying somehow love continues on. And we describe some sense of union between people in this life, the next life, and the holy. But there are wide variety of views about this. I noted there in a very small little asterisk that this notion I have of a universal promise to all is certainly not shared among others. There are many people who would call themselves Christians and say that, for example, Christians alone, are guaranteed this promise. And it's not a view that I share, but if it might be important for people to understand the theology that's going to be expressed in a service that is in a Christian context, because there's a wide variety. And in some instances, if it does not at all mesh with your understanding, it could actually be disconcerting to stumble upon some religious beliefs that you do not yourself hold. And now the next slide, please. There is I think one of the main reasons that people in church come together for some kind of a service is that wonderful idea of tradition. It's just what Rabbi Laura talked about, that there is a value for multiple generations because this is a life cycle of tradition. We have traditions when a baby is born, we have traditions as they get older, we have traditions as people are married, and then also at death. And if there is a service at the end, it seems like a completion of many of those life cycle traditions. It also is often a way to have people across different generations all feel comfortable that there is a ritual that's being undertaken that they all understand. We find that some people come to us because they want a setting that literally conveys in some fashion a sanctuary. And of course, that's again a broad term. But one thing I say to people when I'm talking to them is that all, at the beginning of the service, all emotions that you might feel today, whether it's grief, huge loss, or whether it's a sense of relief and new birth, whatever the feeling is, you might still feel anger, all of those things have been felt in that space over the years and years and years that people have been gathering in this way in that space, and they're all acceptable. All of those feelings may be felt in this ritual that we engage in at the end of life. Next slide, please. It really is a sanctuary. I discuss here just a little bit about the liturgy, which is a set pattern for worship. Rabbi Laura talked about some of the patterns that are found in her church. What I have found is there's certain churches that will follow a liturgy. That means something that's sort of pretty well understood and scripted out, but it depends on the church. The advantage, if you are following a liturgy, is that it's a set pattern of worship, and you're not going to be surprised. You're also going to have many fewer decisions to make with the clergy person. The advantage, even if you are not going to be in a church setting, but you want to have a non-secular service, is that you might think about some of the elements that show up in a traditional liturgy because they've passed the test of time over a long time. For example, I indicate there that there are these patterns that often help make a service go well, that you have whoever is the presider, family and friends, and the congregation all have roles. There can be a rhythm of spoken words, singing, and silence. Those are all often good elements in any service if you were to construct it yourself or if you were going to come to a church. There are different ways in which words can be spoken. Sometimes it's between the presider and the congregation. We can all speak together. And usually, and this is a big advantage, when it's set, it usually ends in about an hour. I really encourage you, whatever service that you are engaged in, that is usually absolutely an adequate amount of time. I've worked with people who, when we do the math and add up all the components, it's going to turn out to be a 2-hour service. And that's when we start cutting and deleting and saying not all of this is possible. But again, that's up to you. The thing that's even within a pattern of a liturgy that a church may have that they typically use, it can be adapted to the individual. Now that depends upon the church that you're seeking out. There are certain churches who will not vary their liturgy at all. It's understood, especially in churches that have a hierarchy, that if, for example, a Catholic Mass has been established, by Pope and by bishops that is followed in every Catholic church, then there will be much less variation in terms of what you might insert or delete. There's some ability to shape it to yourself, but in my tradition, where I am, we have enormous flexibility, but that would be something to look for as well. How adaptable is the particular service that you might be embarking upon in your individual family's case. Next slide, please. The typical elements of a service, if it's a Christian service, but you might consider this even if it's a secular service, are some kinds of readings. We use Holy Scripture, we say from the Bible. People often choose some poetry, music, prayers of some kind, if you're invoking the divine, a eulogy. I've been in services where there have been many eulogies, but again, it's a function of time, and then a sermon. I tend not to use a sermon, giving way for more of the eulogies, but some services certainly will. And there are certain Christian traditions in which they'll also have what's called communion or the Eucharist. Next slide, please. As we think about these different options for readings, you get to choose the readers often and the readings, and they're both things that are worth thinking about. If you are the person you're thinking forward to your own service, these are the kinds of things you might want to think about in advance. Certainly for those who are left, the mourners, in my tradition, these would all be questions I would be going over with people. Who are the readers going to be? I generally really encourage you, if you're going to have readers other than the clergy person, to make sure it's somebody who really enjoys reading in a public setting. When I say readers, I mean something that the content is known, it's been chosen ahead of time, be it a Bible passage or a poem. There's an advantage for some people that the content is known ahead of time. It is not every person who you want to have creatively developing something such as a eulogy. There are people who you will know in advance would be best off being included by reading something that you all agree on in advance is known and acceptable. Obviously, issues like rehearsing in the microphone and extra copies, if you want, you're coming up to the place to read and suddenly you have no idea where your copy is. So those are just details. But readings, poetry, scripture, some short prose. This is not to be the necessarily the largest part of what happens, but they're often things that people want to add to help themselves. I called after the Bible scripture, I said, in our view, the Bible is just this extraordinary library. It's made up of history. It's made up of poetry. It's made up of, things that are laments. There are just so many different things. So keep that in mind as you're choosing. There's a great variety from the Bible, and you can get suggestions for readings. They're often up to you to choose. Next slide, please. Music. The key thing I found is whether it's going to be live or recorded music. I really recommend that you talk to a professional about this. We prefer strongly live music if possible, but there's a cost involved to that. There are just more problems that can arise with the technology if you're using recorded music, but that may be exactly what you you want to use. We have an organist, for example, and to ask him to play a Beatles song is less good, you know? So think about what the music is that's available. For some people, this becomes a central part of the service. So if music is extremely important to you, that might be something that you plan for yourself in advance, or that you think of your beloved who has died and what music they might want. Another element, we can go into the next slide, are prayers. Now, I used something that I learned as a teenager, so forgive me, it's rather simplistic, but the word acts, if you look on the left there, ACTS, there's so many different kinds of prayers too. There's adoration is the A, confession, thanksgiving, and then S is for supplication, which are when we're making requests. But there are so many kinds of prayers, some of which are already written and found in liturgies, old ones, new ones. But if you were creating something for yourself and you do want to be addressing one you consider the divine or the holy, these are different ways that can be done, giving thanks for the person who has died. There can be affirming the grace and forgiveness that is there for all of us. There are different ways of approaching prayer. These are just some ideas, but they're not just one type. So be aware of that, all those options. Next slide, please. Another thing that happens in the services that I lead is there's always a eulogy, if not more than one eulogy. It has, there are many people who want to offer a special reflection on the life of the deceased. And this becomes the opportunity for that. If you're in a Catholic church, for example, typically you are limited to give one eulogy either before the Mass actually begins or one after. That's because the idea is that coherent service called the Mass should not be broken up by something extra. But in a nod toward the fact that that's important to people, there is one allowed either right before or right after the service. In services that I've been involved in, eulogies are often very important component. When my own dad died, he was a minister also. He thought eulogies should not belong in the service. So we met afterwards at a reception and people had things that they had to offer. So there are various views on this. And if you are having multiple eulogies, it's important they not repeat. So if people compare notes, maybe think about different parts of the person's life. But some of the really unfortunate services or two things happen. One is there's a lot of repetition of the same stories. Or number two, and this is the last bullet on this slide, people try to extemporaneously eulogize someone. Please never, ever, ever allow that. Rabbi Laura is nodding her head. Everyone thinks they can. It's hard to write it out in advance. But when we are in a time of mourning, our brains don't connect with our mouth in the usual way. And you end up saying something you don't want to have said. You're too short, you're too long, or you actually say something that is really very hurtful, often without intending to say so. So I require people, to the extent you can, to write out what they're going to say in advance and to time it. About 500 words is usually, at least for me, 4 minutes long, but people need to know to work in, you owe it to yourself, to the person who has died, to really work on that and prepare that in advance. It's quite important. The next slide, please. There's another component in our service, which is sort of a sending forth. How do you reach closure in some fashion? We have a King's Chapel prayer book, which is really following the Anglican model. These words have changed a little bit. Sorry for the noise in the background here, downtown Boston. But again, different people would have different words you might want to use. Go forth in the name of, is God the word you utilize? Go forth in the name of the holy, go forth in the name of the eternal, the almighty. This would be up to you, but some kind of recognition. It's like what Rabbi Laura said about shoveling the dirt on. If there's not going to be a burial right after the service, it's important to have some closure in the service and not just all drift away. So we have done it this way, to say, may you live in peace. May you find your place in God's kingdom and, resting in peace. And our language would be rising in glory. Next slide, please. Practical helps. Personnel, just look for, wherever you can find them, personnel who can easily share appropriate service elements. The rabbi and I have all sorts of things. We know what different options are. We've done many of these services. We can just share them with you, and there's a benefit to that. If you're also working with a professional who understands mourning and the grief process, that can be a benefit. I often am engaged in doing some family counseling, really, at the time that we're planning a service or in the service itself, because there is not a single family in the world that is not complicated, that is not going through a variety of, emotions, disagreements, hardship at this very hard time. And to the extent that you are working with someone who is a professional, that can be a great blessing to the family at the time. And finally, flexible timing. In the Christian tradition, increasingly more people are having a memorial service much later. And so that means that you don't have to have a service quickly. But that's up to you. It's up to your sense of what the family most needs, whether you need to gather people, or if we're doing it on Zoom now, people can be gathered sooner. But just know that in our tradition, there are two ways that it can be done: a funeral that is done near the time of death, and then a memorial service celebrating the person's life, which can be done at a much later time. Next slide, please. This is, Laura and I wanted you to know about the benefit of planning ahead and what you can do for others. I consider it really to be a gift if you want to give some thought to your own end as it is coming, and think about what it might look like, because it is a burden, not an insurmountable burden, but there's a burden to all the details that need to be thought about after a death. And to the extent that you give some advanced thought to it, those you leave behind will not have to be immediately dealing with just a myriad of details. It can be part of the grief process. It can actually be very healing to go through that. But for some people, they just find it an enormous burden. That I underlined in the middle of the page there, some initial research on possible religious leaders who share your central values can be useful. I have had families call me, and I'm their fifth call, and they've been shocked to realize places they assumed they could have a service only provide the service for members. Will not allow them to, do X or Y that they feel is fundamentally important. So to the extent that you, or hold a theological view that will be very damaging for some other members of the family. For example, I mentioned before, if there are churches that are going to preach in the midst of this service that only some people, that there are people who are going to hell and there are people who are going to heaven, and a huge swath of you are in the hell category, to me that would not be healing at all. So it's worth doing a little research if you're able. Obviously, if you're already a member of a congregation, that solves the problem. But I mentioned up above, even above that, my first point, I actually, dear friends, believe that the service is for the living. So while those of us who are planning for our end want to be helpful and to make some suggestions and think about what would be meaningful for us, ultimately, we will not be there in the way that we have been during our human life. You may understand yourself to be present in other ways. I do, but the service is really for those who are still living. And therefore, while I encourage you to give some thought ahead, I suggest you not put things in concrete because it doesn't allow for what the needs may be of those who are left behind. In particular, I'm dealt with a number of families where someone has asked, please do not give me a service. You may think that's the easiest thing to do for your family, but it doesn't take into account if they need some service of some dimension that provides closure, even if it's the smallest gathering, as I did one recently, because we're in COVID times. There were 3 people there plus myself, and we lit candles. It's really all we did, and I said some prayers, but the mourners needed something. So consider that. Finally, it is sometimes helpful if there are going to be conflictual situations to designate one person that you'd like to make primary decisions about this. And finally, well, I've already said I think they should be left flexible. I think there might be, is there another slide or is that the last one? Okay. The other things I haven't talked about are the disposal of the body and cost. These services and everything attendant to death can be costly, unexpectedly. And so if you ask to have a 10-piece orchestra present, you might just want to think about who covers that cost. That's all I think I had to offer. Laura?
Thank you. I'm going to share one last slide. As we spoke about this, the sort of importance of planning, in the middle of March, all the planning that our, traditions do kind of got thrown a little bit of a wrench, right? And what do we do in this moment? So, and I think that for many of us, those rituals that I think, it was interesting, Joy, to watch your slide presentation. We share so many, there's so much overlap, there's so much more similarity than there is difference. And yet those rituals that we've all held on to and are so important to us have kind of been stolen a little bit by the pandemic, and it has been hard. But we have been able to adjust. It is not necessarily the same, but it is, we have made things work. So let's see if I can get to that next one. Is it going to go? Is it going to advance? There we go. Okay. So I like to frame everything in this idea of blessings and challenges, right? So the silver lining, so to speak. I'm not going to sugarcoat this one. I would say that in the reality of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the ebbs and flows of it, have been more challenges than perhaps many of us have seen in our entire lifetime. And it has forced all of us to modify rituals in ways that we never would have imagined. Thank goodness for technology, but also technology has been challenging as well. Having done, unfortunately, many of these types of funerals in these last few months, the health and safety protocols have really required difficult adaptations. Early on, people were unable to be with their loved ones as they were leaving this earth. There have been limited attendance at funerals. I unfortunately have done a few funerals just by myself with technology streaming in, or graveside just with immediate family members. Really painful for people and painful for me as well. I don't know. I think Joy and I spoke about this. Like we in this profession, we get into this profession because we love people and we love being with them in these moments, both the joyful moments and the sad moments. And appropriate touch and that sort of moment, it was impossible. It was been really hard. And time constraints. Like I agree, it's important to have services that are like a certain limited time, but early on, and it's changing a little bit now, we were asked to be very quick. And so a lot of these things that we did, we weren't giving eulogies actually in March and April, or they were done afterwards. But technology has helped us. It can ease the pain and the disappointment. We've seen Zoom funerals and Shiva. We've live streamed services from our sanctuary. The slideshows of remembrance actually have been one of the things that I have found really meaningful in a lot of services that I've attended, either as a participant or as the officiant. Lots of opportunities for music, both in the recorded way as well as professionals playing. We can't sing together, but we can really bring music into that moment. And I think for me, which has also been interesting in all of the life cycle moments, is more of a global attendance. Sometimes people pass away and people are unable to get to be there for the funeral, and it's difficult. But now when there is this technology, people can be there in a way that is kind of unexpected and a blessing for the family. I will stop there. And I know there must be people who have questions, or maybe we've been so complete that you just don't have any questions and you're ready to go. But I believe, I'm not sure, I think it's Barbara or Betsy who's coming back on to ask us questions, perhaps that have been asked by our participants.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Laura and Reverend Joy. We're very grateful for your insights and help on this tough topic. I'm wondering if maybe Joy, you can expand a little bit. Laura has spoken about some of the creative uses of technology. Could you give us a sense of some of the more creative or most creative approaches you've seen?
Well, Laura spoke about that because she has more experience than I do on that. I have been a participant in a memorial service, but I haven't conducted one through this medium. I have conducted weddings through them, and I agree that the main thing is, as Laura said, that you have people who get to be there from around the world who otherwise would not have been able to be present with you. But I think it is worth giving some energy and thought to what the technology is going to be. So the people who've thought through in advance the camera, where the camera is going to be, what the angle is going to be, who's going to show up, just as we did for this presentation. We knew in what order we were going to speak. It's worth paying attention to the technology, I would say. I've seen some have been better than others. And it's not that hard to have a tripod if you're doing this yourself, which you want, because you don't want everything to jiggle, but that swivels, for example, as I saw a bride, walking down a pathway. But I would say that the hardest part, I'm just repeating what the rabbi said. The hardest part is not being able to touch people. The best part is being able to have people from afar. In our church, you could not do the presentation that she's spoken of, like a slide presentation for someone. We're not set up for that. We're an ancient historic church, and we don't have big screens in our church. But you could do that on Zoom. You could tell, someone's story using that kind of different slides and photos and the like. And I think that's a real advantage. But maybe we should throw it back to Rabbi Laura, because she really.
I would say also, not to get too technical for people in terms of the planning and thinking this through, what we've learned in all of our services and life cycle is the importance of having, and people who are watching can't see this, but the production side crew. There are people who are, Zoom experts now, who are muting people, who are monitoring the chat room, who are, kind of helping on that side. It's extremely, extremely important in terms of the smoothness of a service and sort of planning through for that. And there is possible to have small in-person things. And if you're going to do what I refer to as the hybrid, you have to think about that as well. If you're conducting a service, for example, in a sanctuary, and there's a small group of people who are there, do you have the right cameras, the right angles, the right sound, so that it's also coming through? For the people who are watching, who are live streaming, who are not necessarily on a Zoom call. It's definitely its own different set of challenges.
There are, production companies we use for our service who's willing to help and be present and, set up all of that. So if that were to become an issue, there are people you can hire who have all the necessary people.
Right. And we've seen some funeral homes also kind of rise to the occasion as well, with having, if there's something to be graveside or in their chapels, they've been outfitting as well. I think everyone is learning as quickly as possible wanting to not necessarily replicate what was and just put that online, but to sort of take the best of what we do and modify it so that it can be a meaningful experience for people.
There's an advantage also that you have a recording. I mean, it is
Right. Yeah.
recorded, you know, a memorial service, and yet it can be something that people might want to look at again, or
Yeah.
want to share with someone who wasn't physically able to be there.
Absolutely.
We have another question. Where does the tradition of burying the deceased rapidly come from?
It's because there's no embalming, because it's the body goes back to the earth, the soul goes back to God, the body goes back to earth, and so in the Jewish tradition there's no embalming, so it happens quickly. Usually in Israel and in other places, in a more sort of observant group of Jewish community, it would happen within 24 hours, unless it gets interrupted by the Shabbat or Jewish holidays and things like that. But also the sort of difference I've sort of seen is that the kind of gathering happens afterwards, right? So to sort of put our loved ones into their final resting place, and then the remembering kind of happens afterwards. And in some faith traditions, the remembering happens first, and then there is the sort of funeral. Both are appropriate. I think, as Rev Joy mentioned, sometimes people are choosing to have memorial services much later. We're seeing that now as well. We have for many years, but especially in this sort of challenging time, a lot of people are postponing the larger service. They're doing a simple graveside service, but then hoping that they'll be able to gather and do a celebration of life, you know, when we're able to gather again in a significant way.
We have two questions. One, is there a place to go to find worksheets or pamphlets that you could suggest for, you know, people wanting some checklist reminders of, you know, these are the things we should be thinking about? And also, more specifically, this person asks, as a lesbian Jewish elder, are there facilitators who would preside over a Jewish person who wanted to be cremated?
Want to answer the resource question first, Rev Joy?
I've personally prepared, you know, checklists like that I'm happy to share in whatever way is appropriate. You all hear the helicopter right above. I'm right on the common. So you know, I'm happy to. That's what I do when I meet with them, give them a checklist.
If you could send those to us, we'll post them on our website at Beacon Hill Village, if that's helpful.
I'm happy to do that. Do you have things to offer?
Yeah, so we have a beautiful, I would put a booklet that was put together by members of our caring community a couple of years ago with help from a rabbi who was part of this community. It's a beautiful book with like both the checklist as well as kind of explaining Jewish tradition and these kinds of ideas. So I'm happy to, and it lives on our website, and I'm happy to share a link with you, Barbara, and people can come and download it and use it. I used it for part of our presentation, which is a really nice part of information. I'm sorry, what was the second question? The Jewish lesbian elder cremation?
Right, are there facilitators Absolutely. Who would preside?
Well, whoever you are, Abrasley@templeshalom.org. Feel free to be in touch with me directly. Not only can I help you, but I know many, many, many colleagues who can help you as well. Cremation has continued to sort of expand in the Jewish community, and I would probably put it at about 30% of the people that I'm asked to officiate at their funerals have chosen to be cremated. So many, many, many progressive rabbis and cantors are more than willing and happy to sort of officiate at those moments, knowing that it's, you know, I often, and I can't speak for all rabbis, like by no stretch of the imagination, but I want to officiate at the life cycle event that someone wants, and I use my tradition as a guide. As Rev Joy mentioned, there are certain things that are in my tradition and in other traditions that I don't find healing, and I know other people don't as well. And every clergy has their own kind of ideas and understandings and how we kind of negotiate this. But at the end, we all deserve the funeral that we want.
What can a child do to help a parent having difficulty facing their own mortality in doing this kind of planning? Or do you just
Is it
avoid it?
an adult child?
Yes. Say, like, for me, with my father.
You know, I met with someone recently, within the last year, who knew she was dying. And she asked to meet with me, and she said, I don't know how to die. No one ever taught me. And she was such a worldly, wise, beloved, person. And I was stunned by that. And it just reminded me that sometimes what keeps us from bringing up the question is we just feel ignorant. We just don't even know how to start or how to begin. I know that Beacon Hill Village has done a lot of work on some of the other end of life conversations that you encourage people to have about living wills and the like. But I think there are two things. One is I have my granddaughter who's 2 years old. And I read a book this morning that was about worries. And this worry keeps growing bigger and bigger. Her chair next to her and, taking and filling her backpack. And the bottom line of the story is when you talk about it, the worry goes away. So I do believe that it may be that the person you're concerned about is just so worried or so, and you might get shut down right away, but it may be a very loving thing to do to just raise the question. You could even say, I was just on a program and saw this, and there were some ideas I'm sure you've thought about your own death and what will come about. And I would love to be able to, be with you on this piece of the journey in the way that you would be most helpful to you. Again, you may get shut down, but you've tried.
I wonder also if it's like speaking about death doesn't hasten death. It doesn't bring it on. It actually, I think, I love this book, this worry, right? Like, if I don't think about this, it's like with that task that you're avoiding, whatever it is, the dishes in the sink, not to put the same two in the same category, but it is going to happen, right? For all of us. And to have the conversation when my mother passed away, there had been no planning. And I remember the sort of like the rush to do all of the things, that trying to figure out what it was that she would have wanted, and probably not grieving until many months afterwards. And a few weeks later, I went to my father and said, I'm not doing this again. I love you, and I want to enjoy the life that we have together in this moment. And so I want us to set aside time and for you to share with me what's important to you, as whenever your life decides to come to an end, and what you want that to look like, both in terms of how you want to, spend the last months of your life and hospice, things like that, as well as your funeral and, who gets this painting, all of it, this sort of thing. And it was a really powerful conversation. And so now I know, he knows, it's all taken care of, and we don't have to, we could talk about it again, but it's not it doesn't hold us in that way. And he is 83 and going strong. He's going to outlive all of us, I think. He's a good guy. So it's hard. It's a hard conversation. And it also doesn't have to happen all at once. right? You can do it over a series of conversations.
I would think planning must be more complicated today when you can't really sit down
Mhm.
with another person and really talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have an easy answer for that one. Yes, you're right. It does. It is. This is not the medium in which we want to have these difficult conversations. We shall move through this. We shall get onto the other side of it. We will have a different way of being in the world at some point. You know, my colleague here at Temple Shalom and I, we have, we've been permitted, we are doing, you know, sort of small in-person things that make sense and, you know, socially distanced with masks outside as the weather holds, to have these conversations with people. It is easier. It is easier to do in person, I think.
Very specific for you. People find this preschool book on worry.
Yeah.
That sounds great. That's a great book.
I think it's Ruby. I think her name was Ruby. Ruby's Stories, or I don't know, but it was great.
Well, I think unless somebody's typing madly away, that may be the last question we have. So do we have people typing? Not seeing anybody. Well, thank you very much again. And I will head out.
And I'll thank you again on behalf of Beacon Hill Village. I thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience, and for giving all of us that nudge to at least make plans. And actually, another option for some of us is you can write it down. You don't necessarily always, it's better to have the conversation, but you can leave cues if you can't quite bring yourself to have the conversation.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much. It's just been extraordinary. I want to mention that Living Well, Ending Well has the next program coming up on December 1st is Dr. Charles Ciesler, who's an expert on sleep. He's head of the sleep program at the Brigham and Women's and a professor at the Harvard Medical School. We also have wonderful programs coming in 2021 with some very well-known experts, like Edward Benz will be talking about cancer, and Joanne Manson about nutrition. So keep an eye on the schedule, and we'll let you know about these. Thank you. Over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Betsy. And thank you, Rabbi Laura and Reverend Joy. This was an insightful conversation, hopefully useful for people who were here with us for the past hour. Very insightful. Thank you. And thank you to all of you who joined us for this conversation. And we hope that you'll join us again. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.